It's a clear morning on January 28, 1986 at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The sun rises over Launch Pad 39B, where the Space Shuttle Challenger stands ready for launch. 7 astronauts prepare for what should be a routine mission. Among them is Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from New Hampshire, about to become the first civilian in space. Across the country, millions of school children are gathering in classrooms to watch the launch live on television. It's supposed to be an inspiring moment for an entire generation. But hundreds of miles away, a group of engineers spent the night before in a desperate conference call. They presented data. They raised alarms. They pleaded with management to postpone. Their concerns were dismissed. The launch was approved anyway. By the end of the day, a tragedy that could have been prevented would claim 7 lives. The question that would haunt everyone: why didn't they listen? This is the story of the Challenger disaster. The Space Shuttle program. The Space Shuttle represented NASA's vision for routine access to space. Unlike the single-use rockets of the Apollo era, the shuttle was designed to be reusable. Launch like a rocket, maneuver in orbit like a spacecraft, and land like an airplane. It was an engineering marvel that promised to make space travel almost commonplace. The shuttle system consisted of 3 main components: the orbiter, the iconic white spacecraft with its distinctive delta wings, carried the crew and cargo. Attached to its belly was a massive orange external fuel tank containing liquid hydrogen and oxygen. Flanking the tank were 2 white solid rocket boosters, each producing 3.3 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. Those solid rocket boosters would become the focus of the investigation that followed. Mission 51L was supposed to be special. The crew of 7 included Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. McAuliffe's presence had generated unprecedented public interest in the mission. She planned to teach 2 lessons from space, broadcast to students across America. The mission had already been delayed 6 times due to weather and technical issues. By late January, pressure was mounting to launch. NASA had scheduled an ambitious series of flights for 1986, and every delay created a ripple effect through the program. Congressional appropriations were being debated. The agency's reputation for delivering on its promises was at stake. But there was a problem that no amount of schedule pressure could overcome. The solid rocket boosters weren't designed to launch in freezing temperatures. The night before. On the evening of January 27th, engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters, gathered for an emergency teleconference with NASA managers. The forecast for the following morning showed temperatures dropping well below freezing. This had never happened before in the shuttle program's history. The solid rocket boosters were made in segments, stacked on top of each other like massive metal cans. Between each segment sat rubber O-rings, designed to seal the joints and prevent hot gases from escaping during launch. These O-rings were critical. If they failed, superheated exhaust would burn through the booster casing, leading to catastrophic failure. Bob Ebeling and Roger Boisjoli, 2 senior engineers at Morton Thiokol, had been studying O-ring performance for years. They knew something that terrified them. The O-rings became stiff and less flexible in cold temperatures. At 30 degrees Fahrenheit, the rubber would be too rigid to properly seal the joint. During the teleconference, Boisjoli presented his data. Previous launches had shown O-ring erosion, and every instance had occurred on relatively cool days. At 53 degrees, they'd seen concerning damage. At 30 degrees, the O-rings might not seal at all. His recommendation was clear and urgent: do not launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The Thiokol engineers unanimously recommended postponing the launch. But NASA managers pushed back. They questioned the data. They asked why Thiokol was suddenly changing their position. They pointed out that the shuttle had flown successfully in cool weather before. The pressure was immense. Careers were on the line. Schedules had to be met. At some point during the night, Thiokol management asked for a private caucus away from NASA. The engineers repeated their warnings. The O-rings would be too cold. The risk was unacceptable, but management saw the situation differently. They couldn't prove with absolute certainty that the launch would fail. Without definitive proof of danger, they felt they couldn't justify another delay. When the teleconference resumed, Thiokol reversed their recommendation. They told NASA it was safe to launch. Bob Ebeling went home that night and told his wife, "It's going to blow up." Roger Boisjoli couldn't sleep. The decision haunted him immediately, even before the disaster occurred. They had done everything they could, presented every fact, made every argument, and they had been overruled. The launch was scheduled for 11:38 a.m. Morning of the launch, January 28th, dawned clear and bitterly cold. Ice covered the launch pad in sheets. Icicles hung from the tower like frozen daggers. The temperature sat at 36 degrees at sunrise and had been as low as 28 degrees during the night. Launch pad workers had never seen conditions like this. The ice inspection team reported their findings to launch control. Some managers expressed concern about ice potentially damaging the shuttle's thermal tiles during liftoff, but attention remained focused on the weather forecast for abort landing sites, not on the structural integrity of the booster joints sitting in the freezing cold. At the crew quarters, the 7 astronauts ate breakfast and began suiting up. Krista McAuliffe was excited and nervous, the same as anyone about to realize a lifelong dream. She'd spent months training for this moment, learning to float in microgravity, preparing her lessons, saying goodbye to her students in Concord. Her parents, husband, and 2 young children were at Kennedy Space Center to watch the launch. Across America, televisions in school classrooms flickered to life as teachers gathered their students to witness history. The first teacher in space was about to lift off. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown reached 0. The 3 main engines of the orbiter ignited first, building up to full thrust. Then the 2 solid rocket boosters lit with a thunderous roar. 6 million pounds of thrust pushed the shuttle upward, slow at first, then accelerating rapidly. The vehicle cleared the tower and rolled into its flight path, climbing toward the morning sky. In mission control, flight controllers watched their screens with practiced calm. Everything looked normal. The voices remained steady and professional as they called out the milestones. 50 seconds into flight, all systems appeared nominal. But on the right solid rocket booster, something had already gone wrong. At ignition, the solid rocket boosters experienced a tremendous shock as tons of propellant began burning. The entire structure flexed and bent under the enormous forces. In the field joints between segments, the O-rings were supposed to move and seal any gaps that opened up. The O-rings were too cold, too stiff. They didn't seal properly. At 0.678 seconds into the flight, cameras captured a small puff of black smoke escaping from the aft field joint of the right solid rocket booster. The O-ring had failed to seal and hot gases were leaking through. The puff disappeared quickly as aluminum oxides from the burning propellant temporarily plugged the gap. For the moment, the breach was sealed by accident, not design. The shuttle continued climbing. At mission control, no one noticed the puff of smoke in the video feeds. The telemetry showed no warnings. Commander Scobie reported back to Houston. "Roger, go at throttle up." It was the last transmission from Challenger. At 58 seconds, the temporary seal failed. A plume of flame appeared on the side of the right solid rocket booster, burning through the metal casing like a blowtorch. The jet of superheated exhaust began to destroy the external fuel tank structure. The shuttle was traveling at nearly 2,000 miles per hour. The aerodynamic forces were enormous. As the external tank structure weakened, the right solid rocket booster began to pivot. Its attachment struts, never designed for side loads, started to fail. At 72 seconds, the right booster broke free entirely and struck the external tank. Liquid hydrogen began to leak out. The tank's structural integrity collapsed catastrophically. At 73 seconds, the external tank exploded. The fireball was visible for hundreds of miles. In mission control, flight controllers watched in stunned silence as their screens showed wildly diverging data. Then nothing. On television screens across America, commentators struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. The white contrails of the solid rocket boosters spiraled away from each other against the blue sky, tracing chaotic paths through the expanding cloud of fire and debris. The orbiter had not exploded. Instead, the vehicle had been torn apart by aerodynamic forces as it tumbled at supersonic speed. The crew cabin, being the strongest part of the orbiter, remained mostly intact. It arced upward on a ballistic trajectory, reaching an altitude of 65,000 feet before falling back toward the Atlantic Ocean. Inside the cabin, at least some of the crew survived the initial breakup. Several emergency oxygen packs were activated, something that only a conscious person could do. They fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds, tumbling through the sky, before the cabin hit the ocean at over 200 miles per hour. All 7 crew members were killed on impact. The shockwave that hit NASA and the nation was immediate and profound. President Reagan postponed the State of the Union address and instead spoke to a grieving country. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. He said, "We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." But alongside the grief came questions. How could this have happened? What went wrong? And most importantly, could it have been prevented? The Coast Guard and Navy launched the largest search and recovery operation in history. Ships and aircraft scoured 486 square miles of ocean, looking for debris and remains. The crew cabin was located and recovered, along with much of the orbiter's wreckage and pieces of the external tank and boosters. President Reagan appointed a commission to investigate the disaster. Led by former Secretary of State William Rogers, the Rogers Commission included astronauts Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride, test pilot Chuck Yeager, and physicist Richard Feynman. The investigation focused quickly on the solid rocket boosters. Recovered pieces of the right booster showed clear evidence of the joint failure. Black soot and heat damage told the story of gases that had escaped where they never should have been. Then the commission learned about the teleconference, about the engineers' warnings, about the recommendation to not launch below 53 degrees, about management overruling the engineers' concerns. Roger Boisjoli testified before the commission, his voice breaking with emotion. He explained the O-ring problem, showed his data, described the pressure he and his colleagues had been under to reverse their recommendation. Bob Ebeling would later say that he felt responsible for the crew's deaths for the rest of his life, even though he had fought desperately to stop the launch. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, wanted to demonstrate the O-ring problem in a way that everyone could understand. During a televised hearing, he asked for a glass of ice water. He took a piece of O-ring material, compressed it with a clamp, and dropped it into the ice water. When he removed it, the rubber was stiff and slow to return to its original shape. "I believe that has some significance for our problem," he said dryly. In that simple demonstration, Feynman had shown exactly what the Thiokol engineers had been trying to explain. Cold temperatures made the O-rings unsafe. The commission's report was damning. The accident was caused by a failure of the O-rings due to cold temperatures. But the deeper failure was organizational. NASA's culture had shifted from one of engineering excellence to one of meeting schedules. Warning signs had been ignored. Dissenting voices had been silenced. The agency had become convinced of its own infallibility. The Space Shuttle program was suspended for 32 months while NASA redesigned the solid rocket boosters. The field joints were completely re-engineered with new O-ring designs, heating systems, and additional safety features. The changes cost nearly $500 million. But the more important changes were cultural. NASA implemented new safety protocols and created independent oversight panels. Engineers were empowered to raise concerns without fear of reprisal. The agency acknowledged that spaceflight was inherently dangerous and that schedule pressure could never again take priority over safety. For the families of the 7 astronauts, no redesign could bring back what was lost. Francis Scobie, 46, had been just 2 missions away from retirement. Michael Smith, 40, was on his first spaceflight. Judith Resnick, 36, had become the second American woman in space and was beloved for her brilliance and warmth. Ellison Onizuka, 39, had been the first Asian American in space. Ronald McNair, 35, was an accomplished physicist and saxophonist. Gregory Jarvis, 41, was a satellite engineer finally getting his chance to fly. And Krista McAuliffe, 37, had inspired a generation of students to dream about space. Bob Ebeling carried the weight of the disaster for 3 decades. In 2016, on the 30th anniversary of the Challenger explosion, he told reporters, "I think that was one of the mistakes that God made. He shouldn't have picked me for that job, but I guess he figured I could handle it. I can't." Shortly before his death in 2016, he received letters from NASA and the public assuring him that he was a hero, not responsible for the disaster. He had done everything right. It was those who ignored him who had failed. At Kennedy Space Center, the Space Mirror Memorial stands as a tribute to the astronauts who gave their lives for space exploration. The black granite surface reflects the sun and sky, and cut into the stone are the names of those who died. They were explorers, teachers, engineers, and dreamers. They went to work that cold January morning believing in NASA's assurances of safety. They trusted that the experts had been heard, that the data had been considered, that the right decision had been made. The Challenger disaster stands as a stark reminder of what happens when warnings are ignored, when schedule pressure overrides safety concerns, when institutional culture values conformity over truth. It changed how NASA operates and how society thinks about technological risk. The question that began this story remains: why did they ignore that? The answer is complex, involving organizational pressure, schedule demands, and the dangerous belief that past success guarantees future safety. But perhaps the simplest answer is this: they forgot that spaceflight is hard, that margins are thin, and that the laws of physics don't care about schedules or budgets. 7 people paid the price for that forgetfulness. The Challenger disaster changed space exploration forever and claimed 7 lives. If this story impacted you, leave a like to help others discover it. And if you want to hear more stories of engineering failures and the lessons we learned from them, subscribe to the channel. New videos every week exploring the incidents that shaped our world.